Tom lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and life seemed to flow at a comfortable pace. His house was modest but charming, with a big backyard that featured a beautiful swimming pool. The pool had been a dream of his for years, something he had saved up for and worked hard to install. It was a place of peace for him, a spot where he could unwind after a long day or invite friends over for a weekend barbecue. He cherished the privacy it offered, a personal oasis right in the middle of his own home. For the first few months, everything was perfect. He took good care of the pool, cleaned it regularly, and made sure everything was in top condition. It was his pride and joy. He spent many afternoons lounging by it, enjoying the sun or reading a book by the water's edge. But as time passed, things started to change. The neighborhood had a sense of togetherness, and people often stopped by to say hello. It wasn't long before Tom's neighbors, a young family with 2 kids, noticed his pool. They had always been friendly, always waving when they saw him, but they began to take more of an interest in the pool. At first, they just mentioned how lovely it looked, complimenting him on his backyard. Tom, being the friendly person he was, didn't think much of it. He felt flattered and smiled, offering the occasional thank you. Then one afternoon, after he had just returned from work, Tom noticed something strange. The neighbors were outside, sitting by the pool, enjoying the afternoon sun. At first, he thought it was just a casual visit, but when they didn't leave for several hours, Tom began to feel a bit uneasy. They weren't invited, yet they were acting as though they had every right to be there. Still, Tom didn't say anything. He didn't want to come off as rude, so he let it slide. But the next day, things took another turn. The family showed up again, this time with towels, snacks, and toys for the kids. It was clear they had planned to spend the day by his pool. Tom watched from his window, feeling an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. Was he being too sensitive? He tried to ignore it, but the reality of the situation was starting to set in. His neighbors had begun treating his pool like it was theirs. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, they came over almost every day. Sometimes they would knock on his door, asking if they could use the pool, and other times they would simply stroll right in without asking. Tom, always polite, would nod and smile, telling them it was fine. He didn't want to cause any tension, but inside the irritation was building. It was one thing to be friendly and generous, but this felt like they were taking advantage of his kindness. He had a few quiet moments to himself, standing by the kitchen window, watching them splash around in the water, the kids laughing and playing. And each time he found himself getting more frustrated. It wasn't that he didn't like them. They were nice people after all. But this wasn't what he had imagined when he dreamed of having his own pool. It was meant to be a personal space, a place where he could relax and escape from the stresses of life. Instead, it was becoming a public attraction. Tom started to notice other things. They would leave the gate open when they were done, letting the neighborhood kids wander in and out. He'd come home from work to find empty wrappers, forgotten toys, and pool floats that didn't belong to him. It felt like his peaceful haven was slowly turning into a playground for the entire neighborhood. He couldn't relax anymore. The pool, once a sanctuary, now felt like a source of stress. He had a conversation with his neighbors once, politely asking if they could maybe cut back on the pool visits. "I've been feeling a bit crowded lately," he said, trying to sound casual. They apologized, of course, and promised they wouldn't come over so often. But that promise didn't last long. A few days later, they were back, and it was as though the conversation had never happened. By this point, Tom felt trapped. He didn't want to seem like a grump, but his boundaries were being crossed over and over again. He found himself dreading the weekends when he would usually enjoy the pool, knowing that it would likely be filled with kids and neighbors again. What had once been his peaceful retreat had turned into an endless parade of uninvited guests. The situation kept escalating, and Tom began to feel increasingly uncomfortable in his own home. The situation had reached a boiling point when, one Saturday morning, he came out to find the entire family by the pool once again. They had brought a barbecue grill, set up an entire spread of food, and were laughing and chatting with their friends. It felt like a full-fledged party, without any regard for Tom's space or feelings. It was the final straw. He had been patient, he had been polite, but this was too much. Tom stood by the door watching them. He could feel his frustration boiling over. The family was having a great time, but he was seething. How could they not see what they were doing? How could they not understand that they were taking advantage of his kindness? His home, his pool, this was supposed to be his space, not a community resource. And yet, here they were, treating it like it was theirs. He turned away from the door, his mind racing. He had always tried to be a good neighbor, to be kind and understanding. But now he had reached his limit. Something needed to change. He couldn't just keep letting this go on. He had to do something that would make it clear that his generosity had limits. Tom didn't want to be confrontational, but at that moment, he realized that he had no other choice. The situation had gone too far. It was time to take action. And little did he know, the actions he would soon take would leave everyone in the neighborhood, including his neighbors, utterly astonished. You said now here, ChatGPT said, here is part 2 of the story. Tom spent the next few days feeling the weight of his frustration. The images of the family enjoying his pool, having a barbecue without any consideration for his feelings, played over and over in his mind. He didn't want to keep going on like this. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about respect. He had always prided himself on being a good person, a good neighbor. But this was starting to feel like more than he could handle. Something needed to change. He spent a lot of time thinking, weighing his options. He could talk to them again, but would that really work? He had already tried being polite and asked for some space, but they hadn't respected his boundaries. Confrontation seemed like the only way forward. But Tom didn't want to come across as rude or unfriendly. He didn't want to burn any bridges, especially with neighbors who were otherwise kind. However, he realized that his kindness had been taken for granted, and now it was time to stand up for himself. One evening after another long day at work, Tom came home to find his neighbors once again by the pool. The kids were jumping in and out of the water, and the adults were lounging around, chatting and laughing. Tom stood in his driveway, feeling his frustration flare up. He knew this couldn't continue. He had to act, and he had to act fast. He went inside, made himself a cup of tea, and sat down at the kitchen table. He stared out the window, watching the scene unfold in his backyard. They were in his space again. His sanctuary, the place he had built for himself to relax and unwind, was being overrun. The more he watched, the angrier he felt. He had to make a decision. Tom didn't want to do anything drastic, but he also didn't want to be walked all over anymore. He thought back to a few months ago when everything had been so simple, when he could enjoy his pool in peace without worrying about who would show up next. He knew that his frustration was justified, but he didn't know how to make them see it. How could he communicate that he had reached his limit without sounding like a bad guy? After a few more minutes of deliberating, a thought crossed his mind. He could make a change. Something that would show them he meant business, without being overly confrontational. He wouldn't just confront them. Instead, he would create a situation that would leave them stunned and make them realize the consequences of taking his kindness for granted. It wasn't going to be easy, but it would be worth it. Tom began making plans. Over the next few days, he set aside time after work to make a few changes to his backyard. He didn't let anyone know what he was doing. He worked in silence, focusing on the task ahead. The first thing he did was drain the pool. It wasn't an easy task, but he knew it had to be done. He couldn't just keep looking at the water that had been tainted by the constant presence of others. He wanted to start fresh, to reclaim his space. Once the pool was empty, Tom decided that it was time to do something about the fence. The current fence around his backyard was decent, but it wasn't tall enough to prevent people from peeking in. He went to a local hardware store and bought taller fence posts along with thick wooden planks to cover the area. It wasn't a massive change, but it would be enough to add some extra privacy. He spent the next few days working on the fence, making sure it was solid and high enough to keep his neighbors out. But Tom wasn't done yet. He knew that a change this big needed to be noticed, so he decided to put up a large sign. It wasn't going to be anything too dramatic, but it would clearly communicate his feelings. He chose the words carefully, wanting to be firm but not overly aggressive. The sign would read, "Private property. No trespassing." It was a simple message, but one that left no room for confusion. As he worked, Tom felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It was as though he was finally taking control of his life, his space. For so long he had allowed others to push the boundaries, but now he was drawing a clear line. He was doing this for himself, not out of spite or anger, but out of necessity. He needed to feel like his home was his own again. A few days later, the changes were complete. The pool was drained, the fence was taller, and the sign stood proudly at the entrance to his backyard. Tom stood in his driveway, looking at what he had accomplished. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It felt like the first step in regaining his peace of mind. The next morning, Tom was having his coffee when he saw the neighbors walking up his driveway. They were smiling and laughing, the same carefree attitude they always had. Tom took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. As they reached the gate, they paused when they saw the sign. The mother of the family, who had always been the most friendly, glanced at it for a moment before reading the words aloud. "No trespassing?" she asked, confused. Tom stepped out of the house, his heart pounding. He didn't want to sound harsh, but he knew he had to be firm. "I'm sorry," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "but I've had enough. I need my space back. The pool is no longer available for anyone to use." The neighbor looked at him, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding. "But we've always used the pool. Why is this happening now?" Tom shrugged. "I've asked for some space before and it hasn't been respected. I need to draw a clear line. This is my home and I need to be able to enjoy it without feeling like I have to share it with everyone." The neighbor looked at him, her face softening. "I didn't realize you felt this way," she said quietly. Tom nodded. "I've been too polite for too long. It's not about not being friendly, but it's about respect. I hope you understand." The neighbor nodded slowly, looking at the sign again. "We understand," she said before turning to leave. Tom watched as they walked away, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't easy to set boundaries, especially with neighbors you had always gotten along with, but Tom knew he had done the right thing. He had taken control of his space, and for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of peace. What happened next, though, was something that Tom could never have anticipated. His decision, while seemingly simple, would set off a chain of events that would leave everyone in the neighborhood, his neighbors included, utterly surprised. The days following Tom's decision to set boundaries felt both strange and peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made him second-guess himself at times. But deep down he knew he had made the right choice. The sign was up, the pool was drained, and the tall fence was now in place. His neighbors had yet to approach him, and though part of him feared they might be upset, another part of him felt relieved. This was the first time in a long while that he was able to enjoy his evenings without worrying about whether someone would show up at his door uninvited. The stillness of his backyard was a welcome change. It felt almost like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He no longer had to listen to the sound of children laughing and splashing in the pool, or the voices of neighbors chatting away as if the space was theirs. He could finally sit on his porch in peace, enjoying the quiet of the evening with a cup of tea in his hand, without the nagging thought that someone might come knocking for a swim. However, as the days passed, something unexpected started to happen. The quiet that he had longed for was slowly being replaced by an uncomfortable silence. He hadn't seen his neighbors since the sign had gone up. They hadn't come by to apologize or even check in on him. Tom had always thought that they would at least acknowledge the change, but instead they seemed to be avoiding him altogether. This was strange, especially since they had always been friendly in the past. It wasn't long before Tom started to feel the weight of this silence. He had expected some kind of reaction from them, maybe anger or confusion, but he never anticipated this kind of distance. The more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. He wasn't sure if they were upset with him for putting up the sign or if they simply didn't know how to react. Whatever it was, the lack of communication made him uneasy. He thought back to the many times he had seen them using the pool without asking. At first he had been kind about it, offering small gestures of generosity, allowing them to enjoy his space. But after weeks of feeling overlooked, it was hard for him not to feel resentful. Still, the silence between them was uncomfortable. He didn't want things to stay this way, but he wasn't sure how to break the ice. He had made his decision, but now he was beginning to wonder if he had made the right one. One afternoon, as Tom sat in his backyard enjoying the quiet, he noticed something unusual. His neighbors were standing on the sidewalk in front of his house looking toward the gate. They seemed to be talking, but they didn't come any closer. Tom felt a pang of discomfort. Was this it? Was this the moment they would finally confront him? He stood up, brushing the grass off his pants, and took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He had to be the one to break the silence. Stepping out of his house, he walked toward the gate. As he approached, he saw his neighbor, a woman he had spoken to many times before, look up and catch his eye. She seemed hesitant, unsure of how to approach him. Tom smiled gently, trying to ease the tension. "Hey, how's it going?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his nerves were getting the best of him. The woman looked at him for a moment as if considering what to say. Finally, she spoke. We were wondering why you put up the sign, Tom." Tom nodded, his heart beating a little faster. This was the moment. "Well, I've been feeling a bit uncomfortable with how things have been going," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've been really patient, but it just started to feel like my space wasn't being respected anymore. I needed some privacy, and I didn't know how else to make that clear." His neighbor's expression softened, and she seemed to understand. "I get it," she said quietly. "We didn't realize how much we were overstepping, and I'm sorry for that." Tom sighed in relief. "It's not that I don't like having you around. It's just that I need to have a place to unwind. I work hard, and my pool was supposed to be my escape, but it became more of a public space than I was comfortable with." The neighbor nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I completely understand now. We didn't mean to make you feel that way. We thought we were just being friendly. But I see how it must have felt like we were taking advantage." Tom appreciated her honesty. It wasn't easy to admit when you were wrong, and she had done so with grace. "I didn't want to make a big deal of it," Tom continued, "but I had to do something. I hope you understand." She smiled, and the tension between them began to ease. "We do, Tom, we really do. And I'm glad you said something. It wasn't easy, but we'll respect your space from now on." For the first time in a while, Tom felt a sense of peace. He had been afraid that his actions would cause a rift, but instead, they had led to an open conversation. It wasn't easy to set boundaries, but he had done it, and it had worked. His neighbors weren't upset with him. They were simply unaware of how their actions had made him feel. The next few days were filled with a sense of calm that Tom hadn't experienced in months. His neighbors, while still keeping their distance, respected his wishes. They didn't try to use the pool anymore, and Tom could once again enjoy his backyard without the constant worry that someone might show up uninvited. He had regained his space, and it felt good, but there was something else that Tom hadn't expected. As the days passed, he began to notice a shift in the neighborhood. People were starting to treat each other differently. They weren't just respecting his boundaries, they were respecting each other's. The sense of community that had always existed in his neighborhood was slowly being restored, and Tom couldn't help but feel proud. He had been the one to take the first step, but now it seemed like everyone was learning from his actions. One afternoon, Tom found himself talking to one of his other neighbors, a man he had never spoken to much before. The man seemed to be in a reflective mood, and as they chatted, he mentioned how much he had noticed the change in the neighborhood. "You know," the man said, "I've been living here for years, and I never really thought about how much space we take from each other. But lately, it seems like people are really starting to respect one another's privacy. I think that's a good thing." Tom smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He hadn't set out to change the entire neighborhood, but in some ways that was exactly what had happened. By setting his own boundaries, he had shown others the importance of doing the same. The change had rippled through the community, and now, everyone was more aware of each other's needs. As the weeks went on, Tom's decision to reclaim his space became a turning point. Not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. People were learning how to communicate openly, to respect each other's boundaries, and to create a community where everyone felt comfortable and valued. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. And as Tom sat in his backyard one evening watching the sun set over his newly private space, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had made the right decision. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had made his neighborhood a better place for everyone. The next few days after Tom had set the boundaries felt surprisingly peaceful. He had braced himself for confrontation, for awkward conversations, or even anger from his neighbors. But to his surprise, the atmosphere had shifted. His neighbors hadn't come over again, and when he saw them in passing, they gave him a respectful nod. It was as though the weight of their previous actions had settled in, and they finally understood what he had been trying to convey. Tom had expected a more direct reaction, maybe an argument, maybe some resentment, but instead he was left with an eerie quietness. For the first time in weeks, he could enjoy his morning coffee in peace, without the sound of children splashing in his pool or the distant hum of a barbecue grill. The absence of that constant background noise was almost jarring, but in a good way. His backyard, once a place of tension, now felt like a retreat again. But as the days passed, something strange began to happen. The neighborhood, which had once been so familiar, began to feel different. It was subtle at first. Tom noticed a few neighbors glancing at him differently when they saw him outside. Some of them, who used to wave casually as they passed by, now gave him looks of curiosity, perhaps even respect. He couldn't quite place it, but it seemed like people were talking. Maybe they were talking about him. The real shift happened on a Saturday morning. Tom was in his garage fixing the broken lawnmower when a car pulled up in front of his house. It wasn't his usual neighbors, but a couple he had spoken to only a few times at community gatherings. They had lived a few houses down, and Tom had always admired their well-kept yard and friendly demeanor. The husband stepped out of the car, smiled, and waved. "Hey, Tom," he called out. "How've you been?" Tom smiled back and waved. "I'm good, you?" The neighbor's expression seemed a little more serious than usual. "Good, good. Listen, we were just talking with some of the others in the neighborhood, and we wanted to ask, are you all right? You've been a little quiet lately." Tom raised an eyebrow, slightly confused by the question. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just been taking it easy." The neighbor nodded slowly. "We all noticed that you put up that sign. Is everything okay? You've always been so generous with your pool. We're just a little worried, that's all." Tom's heart skipped a beat. Was he being judged for setting boundaries? For reclaiming his personal space? He hadn't anticipated this kind of reaction, but he knew he needed to be honest. "Well, to be honest, I've just needed some space," Tom said, looking down at the lawnmower. "I've been really patient for a while, but I felt like my boundaries weren't being respected. It was time for me to make a change." The neighbor seemed to understand. "That makes sense. I think a lot of people have taken your kindness for granted, Tom. You've always been so easygoing. But maybe that's made it harder for people to see when you've had enough." Tom nodded, grateful for the understanding. "I didn't want to be rude, but I was starting to feel like I was being taken advantage of. So I decided to do something about it." The neighbor's wife, who had been quietly sitting in the car, smiled warmly. "Well, we think you did the right thing. Everyone's been talking about it, and we all respect your decision. It's not always easy to set boundaries, especially in a neighborhood like this where everyone's so used to being friendly and sharing everything." Tom wasn't sure how to respond. He had expected to be the topic of gossip, but not like this. It felt almost comforting. "We've actually been thinking about the pool situation," the husband continued, "and we wanted to offer something. We know you've been going through a lot with all this, and we figured it might help ease the tension." Tom raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" "Well," the neighbor began, "our kids love to swim, and we've been talking to a few other families around here. We were thinking that instead of everyone just showing up unannounced, maybe we could all pitch in and build a new community pool, something that everyone could use, fairly, with no overstepping anyone's boundaries. What do you think?" Tom blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected such a thoughtful gesture. It was clear that this idea wasn't just about giving him a solution, but about improving things for the whole neighborhood. They didn't just want to help Tom. They wanted to create something that could benefit everyone. "That's actually a great idea," Tom said, a smile creeping onto his face. "I never thought about it that way." The neighbor's wife nodded enthusiastically. "We've talked to a few others, and everyone's on board. We figured it would be a good way for everyone to share the space, but with clear rules and boundaries. No more confusion or uncomfortable situations." Tom was taken aback. The idea of a community pool hadn't even crossed his mind. But it felt like the perfect solution. Everyone could enjoy a pool without stepping over each other's toes. It was a fresh start for everyone involved. Over the next few weeks, plans for the new community pool began to take shape. The neighbors who had been talking behind his back weren't whispering out of judgment. They were brainstorming, coming together to create something positive. Tom found himself at the center of it all, not in a negative way, but as someone who had stood up for himself and, in doing so, sparked a change that would benefit everyone. There were meetings, discussions about the design and location, and even fundraising events to make sure the pool was affordable for all families in the area. Tom had never been much of a leader, but now he found himself stepping up, offering ideas and helping out with the logistics. It felt good to be part of something bigger than just his own backyard. When the pool was finally completed, it was far beyond what anyone had imagined. It wasn't just a place to swim. It was a gathering space, a place where neighbors could come together, enjoy each other's company, and relax without overstepping anyone's boundaries. The pool had become a symbol of respect and community, built from a decision that had started with Tom's frustration and desire for privacy. And when the grand opening day finally arrived, the whole neighborhood turned out. The families, once awkwardly avoiding Tom, were now shaking his hand, thanking him for the idea and his courage to set the boundaries that led to this change. Everyone was smiling. The kids were splashing around in the pool, and for the first time in a long time, Tom felt like his home had become exactly what he had always wanted. A place of peace, privacy, and respect. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about the community that had come together to build something for everyone. A shared space where boundaries were respected, where relationships were strengthened, and where Tom had finally found the balance he had been searching for. As the weeks went by, the new community pool became a centerpiece of the neighborhood, and life slowly returned to normal. But it wasn't the same normal it had been before. There was a new sense of understanding between neighbors, a mutual respect that hadn't existed before Tom's decision. The pool, which had once been a source of tension, had now become a place where people genuinely enjoyed each other's company, without any overstepping of boundaries. Tom, who had once felt frustrated and alone, now found himself at the heart of something much bigger than just a simple backyard. It was a project that had brought people together, and in a way it had healed some of the unspoken divides that had existed. The first few weekends were filled with laughter, children's voices echoing through the air and families chatting by the poolside. Tom was often there, sitting on one of the lounge chairs, watching the scene unfold. It was exactly what he had wanted all along: peace, relaxation, and a sense of community. One afternoon, as Tom sat near the pool, his neighbor came over to chat. It was the same neighbor who had first approached him with the idea of building a community pool. She sat down beside him, a friendly smile on her face. "You know, Tom," she began, "I think we all owe you a thank you." Tom raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "I know it wasn't easy for you," she continued, "setting those boundaries, making that decision, but you've given us all something more than just a pool. You've given us the chance to reconnect as a neighborhood." Tom smiled, feeling a sense of pride. It wasn't about the pool or even the recognition. It was about the change that had happened. What had started as a simple frustration had led to something positive. It wasn't just his own life that had improved. It was the whole neighborhood. People were now coming together in ways they hadn't before, helping each other with projects, sharing meals, and looking out for one another. As the summer months passed, Tom found himself being invited to more social gatherings, more community events. The barrier that had once existed between him and the other families had dissolved. People no longer treated him like the neighbor who was always hiding away in his house. Instead, he was part of the group, someone who had stepped up and made a difference. One evening, after a particularly fun neighborhood cookout by the pool, Tom found himself talking to one of the newer families in the area. They were a young couple with a baby, and they had recently moved in. The wife looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Tom, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice a little hesitant. "Of course," Tom replied, not sure what to expect. "You seem so calm and easygoing. You've always been friendly with everyone. I just wanted to know, how did you know when it was time to stand up for yourself? How did you know when enough was enough?" Tom leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before answering. "I guess it was when I realized that I wasn't happy with the way things were going. It wasn't about being difficult or causing trouble, it was about finding balance. I had to stop being afraid to say no. And when I finally did, I realized that it wasn't just for me. It was for everyone." The woman nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "That makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes we're all so worried about upsetting others that we forget to take care of ourselves. It's like we're scared of what might happen if we set boundaries." Tom smiled, glad that his experience could help someone else. "Exactly. It's not about being selfish. It's about being clear about what you need and expecting others to respect that." As they chatted more, Tom realized how much he had grown through the whole experience. What had started as a simple desire to have some privacy had turned into a transformative moment in his life. He had learned the importance of standing up for himself, of communicating his needs clearly, and of taking action when something wasn't working. The best part was that he had done it without burning bridges. In fact, he had created stronger connections with his neighbors. By asserting himself and setting clear boundaries, he had shown that it was possible to maintain respect and kindness in the community. And in turn, everyone had benefited from it. As the season changed and fall began to settle in, the pool continued to be a hub of activity. The families would gather for weekend barbecues, and in the evenings some would linger by the water, chatting under the stars. Tom no longer felt the weight of frustration hanging over him. His space was respected, and he had helped foster a new sense of unity in the neighborhood. One day, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a soft shade of orange, Tom found himself standing by the pool, his hands in his pockets. He watched as the neighborhood kids played in the water, their laughter ringing through the air. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. This was the life he had wanted all along, a life where he could relax, enjoy the company of his neighbors, and know that his boundaries would be respected. As he stood there, a thought crossed his mind. It wasn't just the pool that had changed his life. It was the courage to stand up for what he needed. By speaking up, he had taken control of his own happiness, and in doing so, he had unknowingly given others the chance to do the same. The neighborhood had transformed from a place where everyone kept to themselves into a community where people cared for one another, where they respected each other's space, and where friendships were built on mutual trust. Tom had played a big part in that transformation, and although he hadn't expected it, he felt proud of the change he had helped create. Looking around at the peaceful scene before him, Tom realized something. Sometimes, in order to create the life you want, you have to take action, even if that means making difficult decisions. It wasn't about being selfish or rude. It was about creating the space for respect, kindness, and connection to flourish. And as the pool glistened under the setting sun, Tom knew that the change he had started was just the beginning. The ripple effect of his actions would continue for years to come, and the neighborhood would always remember the quiet man who had stood up for himself and, in doing so, had brought everyone closer together.